Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Well, let's begin this evening, since we've had a week off. Let's begin to laying a foundation for what we want to look at tonight. When we left our series of Purim a week or so, or 2 weeks ago, we just finished chapter 2 about Daniel having not only interpreted the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had had, but also being able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what that dream had been about before he interpreted it, which were fulfilling the requirements that Nebuchadnezzar laid on the one who would come to do that. And he did this giving all the credit to the God of Israel for being able for himself to do so. Now, the result of this was that Nebuchadnezzar bowed down before Israel's God and worshiped Israel's God. Remind us, though, that this king he didn't forswear any of his previously held gods. He just rather lifted up Daniel's God and made him part of the collection of gods that he served. And this is going to be a theme with Nebuchadnezzar that we're going to see for the duration of this time in Daniel. We also need to remember that as a result of Daniel's being able to tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream and then interpret it, Nebuchadnezzar placed Daniel in a high position in the Babylonian kingdom. He was made head of the regional government of Bavel, the home province of the Babylonian Empire. Daniel was also put in charge of the sages that Daniel had just been in the school studying under previously to this happening. And as we're going to see, this wasn't accepted by the sages with the greatest love towards Daniel and the other 3 young Jewish boys that they had been teaching. And finally, we have to note that Daniel had the king's ear. He was the close advisor to the king of the Babylonian Empire from that point on, an important position in a whole bunch of different ways. One of the things that came out of this acceptance of the God of Israel as an important deity by Nebuchadnezzar was the ability of Jews then to continue to worship Adonai. This was something that was very important, and of course this is what God was after when he put this drill through. Remember that at the beginning of this, Daniel and his 3 friends had all been given new names that were praising the Babylonian gods. The Babylonian gods, in the Babylonians' minds, had defeated Israel's gods. So this whole thing that they were putting Daniel and the other 3 boys through was a brainwashing process to turn them from the God of Israel and let them become good little Babylonian pagans, because they were still in their teen years. Now, not only is the God of Israel accepted here by Nebuchadnezzar, but Jews can also continue to study Torah because of this. And there's Daniel's standing by the king to steer this course. We just serve an awesome God, because He made all this possible. Now in chapter 3 that we're going to get into this evening, we will have another incident with a statue. Not too many people ever take time to look thoroughly at this chapter. It's kind of gotten regulated into the position of being a nice little children's story. If we teach our kids this story and a couple of others, then we've taught them the Bible, and our consciences are clear that our kids now know what the Bible's all about. So the body of Messiah at large tends to look at this as a children's story. And frankly, it is. It's a good children's story. It's got all the elements of a good children's story in it. It's got good guys, it's got bad guys, and the good guys win. I mean, what more could you want for a children's story? But it's really more than that, because it foreshadows more than most people realize, such as events set out in Revelation chapter 13. This chapter 3 of Daniel foreshadows events that are set out for us in Revelation chapter 13. And it also presents a picture of Israel's preservation by God against even what appears to be insurmountable odds. Also embedded in this story is a picture of spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is something important that we have to understand, because we have to understand where it takes place, and it does it in two ways. It's about what's going on the horizontal, that is, things that's being done here on the planet, across the earth, and what's going on in the vertical, in the heavens. And we also have to get into who has authority in these realms. So I want to take you on another little bit of a rabbi trail beyond this vertical and horizontal authority thing. Everyone remembers a story in Exodus, I hope. Israel rebelled against God, and they said, "Moses, we want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to being slaves in the world again. We don't like where you're taking us and what's going on here." And that God didn't let those that rebelled in this manner go into the promised land. Those that rebelled in this manner were kept from going into the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb, who had remained loyal to God, entered the land. But there's another event in there at this same time frame that we need to look at closely. God sends fiery serpents, venomous snakes, to bite Israel as punishment for their rebellion. God sends these. Now, there's a lot of wordplay going on that we're just not going to get into because it gets us outside of our scope of our study. But God sends fiery serpents, again also known as poisonous snakes, fiery serpents in the King Jimmy version. In that region of the world today, they still have some of the most deadly vipers that you would ever want to encounter. The English text now tells us that many people were killed by these. But what we need to understand is that the original language of the text indicates that the annihilation of the whole population of Israel was at hand. Not necessarily had to happen, but was at hand. The whole of Israel could have been wiped out. Remember, you've got fiery serpents or poisonous snakes, and it gets all the way back to Hasatan being introduced in Genesis as the serpent. There's a tie and a connection there. And people realizing what they had done and what God was in the process of doing to them, repented, and they went to Moses and they said, "Have God take away these poisonous snakes, these fiery serpents." But God didn't quite do that. The poisonous snakes remained, but what God did do was create a type and a foreshadow a type and a foreshadow. He constructed a bronze snake, mounted it on a pole, and raised it up. Constructed a bronze snake, put it on a pole, and raised it up. Then any of the people that had been bitten, if they would gaze upon this bronze snake with trusting that God would heal them for doing as they were told, they'd be healed. And this is actually what happened. This is what occurred. The children of Israel saved because of that. So how then is this a shadow of events to come? Let's begin with John chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. It says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Well, hello. The type and foreshadow. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who trusts in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only and unique Son, so that everyone who trusts in him may have eternal life instead of being utterly destroyed. And then after that, we have John chapter 5, verse 24, please. Yes, indeed, I tell you that whoever hears what I am saying and trusts the one who sent me has eternal life. That is, and listen to this, that is, he will not come up for judgment, but has already crossed over from death to life. 1,400 years before John's writing this, there was a transformation from death to life on the horizontal plane, on the world, in the world. A transformation from bodily death to bodily life for those who gazed upon the bronze serpent and in faith believed that God would heal them. Just looking at the serpent didn't do you any good. You had to have the faith that God would heal you. Once you were bitten by one of these serpents, you were dead. You were dead. You might be still breathing for a few hours, but you were dead. Just the burning, searing pain left to go through, unless you looked at the serpent raised on the pole. And again, in faith, believed that God would redeem you from this death. And that event foreshadows Yeshua, who was lifted up on a pole. A transformation from death to life in the spiritual realm. So the horizontal and the vertical are in play here. Transformation to death to life is in the spiritual realm, and the vertical realm is what is pictured for us through Yeshua. Now, the reason for giving you this is to help give us a feeling for what's going on in Daniel chapter 3. Keep in mind what we've just been through and looked at, because it helps to give us a feeling of what's going on in this third chapter of Daniel. What's going on in Daniel 3 is happening on the horizontal plane, the worldly plane. It's picturing for us, though, what happens in Revelation 13, which is happening on the vertical plane, in the spiritual realm. Everybody still with me? So let's go to Revelation 13, verse 11. It says, Then I saw another beast. Keep beast in mind. Beast is going to be important with what we're doing this evening. I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. It had 2 horns like those of a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, the one whose fatal wound had been healed. It performs great miracles, even causing fire to come down from heaven onto the earth as people watch. It deceives the people living on earth by the miracles it's allowed to perform in the presence of the beast. It tells them to make an image honoring the beast, an image honoring the beast. Keep that in mind. And it tells them to make an image honoring the beast that was struck by the sword but came alive again. Next. It was allowed to put breath into the image of the beast so that the image of the beast could even speak, and it was allowed to cause anyone who would not worship the image of the beast to be put to death. Also it forces everyone, great and small, rich, poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, preventing anyone from buying or selling unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This is where wisdom is needed. Those who understand should count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person, and its number is 666. I think everybody has been exposed to that number 666 before. Hang on to it for a few minutes. We're going to do a couple of things that are interesting about that. One more stop, and then we'll be ready to look at Daniel chapter 3. While we're still here in Revelation, let's look at chapter 14, verses 9 through 12. Another angel, a third one, followed them. There were two prior to this, and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image, talking about the statue, receives the mark on his forehead, talking about the number 666, or his hand, and he will indeed drink the wine of God's fury poured undiluted into the cup of his rage. Keep rage in mind. He will be tormented by fire and sulfur before the holy angels and before the Lamb. And the smoke from their tormenting goes up forever and ever. They will have no rest, day or night. Those who worship the beast in his image and those who receive the mark of its name. This is when perseverance is needed on the part of God's people, those who observe his commands and exercise Yeshua's faithfulness. That seems really what we've just read to indicate that those that take on the mark of the beast are never going to be saved. Once they take on that mark, that's it. They've had it. They've committed an act on the horizontal, in the horizontal realm, that has sealed their fate in the vertical realm. So then, let's go to Daniel chapter 3 and see how all this applies. Also, before we even open Daniel 3, let's do something that's interesting while we're going through Daniel chapter 3. Every time it mentions the name Nebuchadnezzar, think of the beast of Revelation 13. And every time it mentions the Babylonian gods, think of Satan, think of Hasatan. Every time it mentions Nebuchadnezzar, don't think Nebuchadnezzar, think beast. And every time it mentions gods of Babylon, think Satan. Because we're going to show where this is a preview in Daniel 3 of Revelation 13. That's why we're studying Daniel before we go to Revelation. It's absolutely amazing to me what's being taught here. All right, Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Nebuchadnezzar, the beast the king, had a gold statue made 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. What did the beast have set up in Revelation? A statue, which he set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Bavel, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. Then the beast, the king, summoned the viceroys, prefects, I'll get it right, governors, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and all the provincial officials to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue which the beast, the king, had set up. The viceroys, prefects, governors, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and all the provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the statue which the beast, the king, had set up. They stood in front of the statue that the beast had set up. And a herald proclaimed, peoples, nations, languages, you are ordered to, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, harp, zither, lute, bagpipe, and the rest of the musical instruments, you fall down and worship the gold statue that the beast, the king, has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship it will be thrown immediately into a hot, blazing furnace. What does that represent? Hades. Therefore, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, harp, zither, lute, and the rest of the musical instruments, all the peoples, nations, languages, is talking about the whole Babylonian Empire, fell down and worshipped the gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar, representing the beast, the king, had set up. Understand that This event is some 18 to 20 years after the events of Daniel chapter 2 that we looked at 2 weeks ago. Daniel and his friends are now in their mid to late 30s. They've been serving faithfully in that pagan Gentile government for all that time. And some teach that this erection of this statue coincides with the final destruction of Jerusalem. Remember that Daniel and his friends were taken into exile on the first visit of Babylon to Jerusalem, but it wasn't until the third visit of Babylon to Jerusalem that Jerusalem was torn down. Look at the description of the statue for just a second. Its height wasn't unusual. The Colossus of Rhodes that was in existence at the same time was 105 feet high. This is 90 feet high. What's unusual is its width, 9 feet wide. By comparison, if you did a statue of a man 6 foot high, he would have been a little over 7 inches wide. That's twice as skinny as I am. Those dimensions make it grossly disproportionate. And I haven't a clue, honestly, as to why, unless it has something to do with its measures in cubits. See, it says 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. You add these two up and you get the number 6'6". Just one six shy of the number of doom. And remember, types and foreshadows, which is what this is, are never complete. So the fact that they would give us the number 6'6", it's not quite complete until you add the third 6. Interesting. Nebuchadnezzar was wealthy. All kinds of gold hauled in from all over his empire. The statue was gold. Some things perhaps wood overlaid with gold, which was commonly done. The image was set up on the plain of Dura, D-U-R-A, which is a common name applicable to any place enclosed by walls. Another rabbi trail for you. 60 miles south of modern Baghdad is ancient Babylon. 6 miles southeast of there, archaeologists found 4 walls, 45 feet to a wall. 60 miles due south of modern Baghdad, 6 miles further southeast, 60 plus 6 again, but not the third 6. 45 feet to a wall, a large square brick construction 20 feet high. And it was thought at the time of its discovery that by its appearance this might once have been the pedestal for the huge image of Nebuchadnezzar. The reason that this statue was conceived and built by Nebuchadnezzar isn't given to us, but a probable reason in my mind was that the image represented the world power Nebuchadnezzar had built himself. It was also to honor the Babylonian gods, our Hasatan, who Nebuchadnezzar, representing the beast, had been given his power. It is through Satan that Nebuchadnezzar is given his power. It is through Satan that the beast in Revelation 13 is given his power. And we have to keep this sidebar running of Nebuchadnezzar as the beast and the Babylonian gods as Hasatan, because they give us a broad picture. Think about this. Maybe the idea from the statue came from the dream of chapter 2. Remember, that dream really shook Nebuchadnezzar up, and he probably wasn't really likely to forget it. But here, the entire statue is gold. The whole thing, top to bottom, not just the head. Remember, the statue in the vision of chapter 2 also represented empires that would succeed Nebuchadnezzar. Some scholars believe that this all-gold statue is expressing a rebellion against the God of Israel. Remember that the beast didn't abandon the gods of Hasatan, didn't abandon Satan. He just acknowledged the existence of the God of Israel. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar was rebelling against the message of the dream God had given him as a revelation of his position in history. This would be a clear statement of rebellion by Nebuchadnezzar in covering this entire statue with gold, not just its head. Who do you think you are, God of Israel? My kingdom will never fall. Look at this puppy that I've just put up about my kingdom. Gold from head to toe. My kingdom will never fall. It's going to last. Nebuchadnezzar, like the beast, then called an assembly of what amounted to all government officials, from the highest clear down to the lowest officials. The entire government structure was required to worship this image. And they all assembled before this image, waiting for the signal for universal worship of this image to take place. Think about that. Universal worship of this image. And there were to be no exceptions. No exceptions. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar is a picture of the beast that's coming. What does the beast of Revelation call for? Total worship by everybody of the statue that he set up. A refusal of anything Nebuchadnezzar asked for was considered treason. And the treason penalty was instant death. And the instant death was in a blazing fire, a preview again of Hades. This was common fare for the Babylonian kings to roast their people that disobeyed their commandments. As if, just for an example outside of what we're looking at here in Daniel, let's go to Jeremiah 29, please, and 20. It said, "So pay attention now to the word of Adonai, all you in exile, whom I sent away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here's what Adonai Tzavot, the God of Israel, says about Achav, the son of Koliah, and Zedekiah, the son of Maaseiah, who prophesy lies to you in my name. I will hand them over to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will put them to death before your eyes." Wow. In fact, all those exiled from Judah who are in Babylon may take up this formula for cursing. May Adonai make you like Zedekiah and Achav, whom the king of Babel roasted in the fire. It was a typical thing that went on in Babylon for those that the king of Babylon didn't want to have anything to do with. Roast them in the fire. The temptation is to stay here and I think really work with this strong play on words. For instance, Zedekiah, which is Zedekiah in most of your English Bibles, means he is righteous, but yet he's giving prophecies that are not of God and saying they are from God, so he's anything but righteous. Let's go back to Daniel 3, where the three young Jews are about to be introduced into the story, who are truly righteous as a comparison to those that aren't righteous. Daniel 3, let's look in verses 8 through 12. "But then some of the Chazdim approached and began denouncing the Jews, and they said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, 'May the king live forever, your majesty. You have ordered everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, harp, zither, lute, bagpipe, and the rest of the musical instruments is to fall down and worship the gold statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship it is to be thrown into a hot blazing furnace. There are some Jews whom you have put in charge of the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men, your majesties, have paid no attention to you. They do not serve your gods. They do not worship the gold statue that you set up.'" Wow. Well, the ugly head of envy has been raised up because the one who was their student had suddenly become their leader. Envy, if not the greatest, is one of the greatest evil dispositions of the mind. Envy has been described aptly as the eldest born of hell. What brought Hasatan to his present state? envy of God. Envy feeds on living, never ceasing until they're dead. Envy is to look in ill will at another person because of what they have. Envy is different from jealousy. It's different from jealousy. Jealousy is a fear of losing something. Envy hates to see another person have something, particularly if the one in envy covets that thing or position for themselves. Now, the accusations of the court astrologers, the Kasdim, is not a mere observation, but is calculated to permanently eliminate these three young Jews. The word in Aramaic that was translated at the beginning of this as denouncing is very interesting. In Aramaic, it literally means they ate their pieces. That is, they intended to devour them a little bit at a time, piecemeal. A slander or malicious accusation which devours the accused piece by piece, just takes them apart. They can't defend against it. And the charges were this. 1, these Jewish men have no regard for the king. 2, they don't serve the gods of the king, or they don't serve Satan. 3, they don't worship the golden image. Again, are we keeping that sidebar, substituting beast for Nebuchadnezzar and Hasatan for the gods of Babylon? We should note that these accusers were quick to point out that these three men were Jews and were in a place of political security, but they are disloyal, they're ungrateful, they're rebellious, showing no regard for the king, the beast himself, or the image he has erected, or Satan through his gods. This charge of not serving the gods of Nebuchadnezzar is not merely pointing out a religious difference. The whole concept of political loyalty here, including the worship of this image, is bound up in the belief that these Babylonian gods, Satan, have favored Nebuchadnezzar, the beast. That's the reason he's in power. And they have given him his victory. To challenge Nebuchadnezzar's gods was to challenge the king himself. The political integrity of these three men was at issue here. So the charges by the accusers specifically focus on this golden image. The charges are calculated to cause the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. Want to see what happens? Daniel 3:13. In a raging fury, Nebuchadnezzar ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. When the men had been brought before the king, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, is it true that you neither serve my gods nor worship the gold statue I set up? All right then. If you are prepared when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, harp, zither, lute, bagpipe, and the rest of the musical instruments to fall down and worship the gold statue, very well. But if you won't worship, you will immediately be thrown into a blazing hot furnace, and what God will save you from my power? See what he's setting himself up to be? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, your question doesn't require an answer from us. Your Majesty, if our God whom we serve is able to save us, he will save us from the hot blazing furnace and from your power. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will neither serve your gods nor worship the gold statue which you have set up. The Kasdim, the court astrologers, had calculated correctly here. The king went ballistic. But to his credit, he gave these three a second chance, or maybe was it that he wanted to see them turn from their God, maybe, to the gods he worshipped? They were brought before him and they were asked two questions. Do you not serve my gods? Do you not worship the gold image? And then, not giving them a chance to answer, he gives them an opportunity to obey by putting them in the setup. If they will obey him, the matter's over. They will become good Babylonian pagans. The alternative is to be immediately executed by being burned to death in the fiery furnace. Then the king utters a boastful and blasphemous statement, and what God can save you from my power then? See, he has set himself up to be above the God of creation, the God of Israel. Let's go back for a minute to Revelation 13, beginning in verse 4. Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it? It was given a mouth speaking arrogant blasphemies. What did Nebuchadnezzar just do? And it was given authority to act for 42 months. So it opened its mouth in blasphemies against God to insult his name and his Shekinah and those living in heaven. See, this is speaking of the beast uttering blasphemies. What is Nebuchadnezzar doing in Daniel 3? Speaking arrogant blasphemies against God. The God of Israel wasn't capable of interfering. This is throwing down a gauntlet in front of the God of Israel. And the God of Israel takes this sort of thing seriously. About 120 years earlier, the king of Assyria had sent his armies down to capture Jerusalem. The commander of this army was a man named Rav-Shakeh, and he made the same arrogant mistake in front of King Hezekiah by saying, there's no God. Your God can't save you. There's no God of Israel. Your God can't save you. If you want to do a little homework, you can go to Isaiah 36, 13 through 30 and read about that story. That boast, there's no God, your God can't save you, cost the Assyrians 185,000 men. The angel of the Lord sent Rav-Shakeh home with his tail between his legs for that statement. The mistake in this boastful arrogance is the claiming of the possession of power as a human being so great that there is no divine source to which a victim of that human being claiming that power can turn to for help. This is what Nebuchadnezzar is saying here. I'm so great that there is not a God around that can help you. Then right there in front of the king, chutzpah. Y'all know what chutzpah is. Right there in front of the king, chutzpah broke out all over the place. Daniel 3:16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, your question doesn't require an answer from us. Well, that's kind of a slam, you know. What are you talking about? We don't have to answer this. Verse 17, your majesty, if our God whom we serve is able to save us, he will save us from the blazing hot furnace and from your power. Verse 18, but even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will neither serve your gods nor worship the gold statue that you have set up. In so many words, they're telling him, we're not going to serve you as the God you think you are, nor worship the gold statue that you set up. Sound like the beast again? Now, we might think at this point that these three Jews should have gone into some kind of lengthy discourse defending their position, but they didn't. They absolutely didn't. I think they understood that this all came down to obedience to the God of Israel, or obedience to Nebuchadnezzar. But it comes down to obedience. Who am I going to be obedient to? The God of Israel or Nebuchadnezzar and the gods behind him, which is Satan. We have to see the connection. An act done on earth, the horizontal, has spiritual implications, the vertical. And their answer to the king is, we don't have to defend ourselves before you in this matter. And this isn't an arrogant response. This isn't an arrogant response. They're not saying we don't have to tell you anything. They're saying the charge brought against us is true and we have no offense, no defense, nor are we going to offer an apology. They understood that this pagan king would never comprehend the reason for the stand that they were taking. And they didn't try to justify their behavior. They just told the king a fact of life. Their God could deliver them from any fiery furnace if he chose to. In any case, they would not worship the king's gods or the gold statue. It's interesting to note in the original text that there is no article, no the, no a. Their God would rescue them from every fiery furnace, not just the one set up in front of them. Any or every fiery furnace, again pointing to the fires of hell. Also note that these three men didn't possess a bit of arrogance in this. They didn't start telling God what he was or wasn't supposed to do concerning their lives. They also indicated to the king that they also faced the alternative that their God might not deliver them. But because their God didn't deliver them would not mean that their God lacked the ability to deliver them. In any case, they will not change their decision. Back to Revelation 13 again, verse 9. Those who have ears, let them hear. If anyone is meant for captivity, into captivity he goes. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he is to be killed. This is when God's holy people must persevere and trust. This is speaking of believers here. So that verse 18 of Daniel 3 reads into just what's happening in Revelation 13, doesn't it? Let's go on in Daniel 3:19, please. Nebuchadnezzar had become so utterly enraged that his face was distorted with anger against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace made 7 times hotter than usual. 7's the number of perfection. Then he ordered some of the strongest men in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing hot furnace. Note that they were tied up. They were bound by the pagans. This becomes important in a few minutes. These men were tied up in their cloaks, tunics, robes, and other clothes and thrown into the blazing hot furnace. The king's order was so urgent and the furnace so overheated that the men carrying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were burned to death by the flames. These 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the hot furnace. Remember when we looked at the people bitten by the poisonous snakes in the desert? They were dead, even though they would go on breathing for a little while. That's the same case here in Daniel 3:19. These 3 were dead as of the moment Nebuchadnezzar said, throw them in the furnace. But they still had a short period left in which to draw a breath. Note another comparison to the poisonous snakes in the desert episode. God set them up in the desert, a bronze snake, that they could gaze upon in faith and believe that they would be saved from death. What has happened now in Daniel 3 is Nebuchadnezzar has set up something for people to gaze on and worship in order to be saved from death. One is the truth, the one in the desert, which is from God, the bronze snake. The other one is counterfeit, which is the gold, solid gold statue set up on the plain of Dura by Nebuchadnezzar, the beast, and the gods of Babylon, Hasatan. Both of these look to the future. We're given what's going to be our choice in the future. Are we going to look at what God set up for us, or are we going to look at what the evil one has set up for us? Because they're both going to be broadcasting, this is what you need to do in order to continue with your life. And those who believe in God, when we reach that point, are going to have chutzpah. Going to have chutzpah, just like those three boys did. Nebuchadnezzar, it says, became further enraged, his face contorted. He orders his strongest men to bind these three men of God and to throw them in the blazing red-hot furnace. So they were bound on the spot in their tunics and in their robes. The king's orders were so urgent and the furnace so hot that the men who carried them and threw them into the furnace were themselves burned to death. And the three men fell bound into the blazing furnace. Now, the reply that had been given back in verses 16, 17, and 18 left no doubt in the king's mind that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not going to serve the gods of Babylon. Astrologies now had full proof of their accusations about these three young men. And Nebuchadnezzar's pride had been severely injured. So we have the distortion of his face mirroring the rage, mirroring the distortion of his mind. And some feel that this condition, Nebuchadnezzar's attitude towards these three men, had so changed that he gave a reckless order, a very reckless order, caused the furnace to be overheated. If you want to think about it, the real torture would have been if the temperature of the furnace had been reduced, so the roasting would have taken longer. Yeah, see, there's no fool on earth like a man who's lost his temper. The chance to worship the image was obviously withdrawn, and the order to execute was given. This was really a hurry-up thing. Under normal conditions, they would have been stripped naked for the execution. Here they're bound fully clothed. The king was so enraged he didn't even want to take the time to have them stripped. Now these Babylonian furnaces were like modern lime kilns. Not lime the fruit, but lime the rock. Breaking lime down so that you can make cement out of it. These furnaces had an opening at the top through which the materials could be dumped in, and an opening at the bottom for withdrawing the fired substances. And the top was approached by a ramp so that what was going to be put in the fire could be dumped in. And again, three things need to be noticed. Three men were thrown into the furnace fully clothed, with obviously flammable clothing on. 2, the heat of the furnace was extraordinarily hot, evidenced by the death of the soldiers. And 3, these men were bound firmly so they could not move when they were thrown into the furnace. And all three of these things are facts that are part of the miracle that we're shown. Daniel 3:24 through 27. Suddenly Nebuchadnezzar sprang to his feet. Alarmed, he asked his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the flames?" And they answered the king, "Yes, of course, your majesty." But he exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men not tied up. 4 men not tied up, walking there around there in the flames, unhurt. And the 4th one looks like one of the gods." Whoa. 4th one looks like one of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the blazing hot furnace and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, you servants of El Elyon being God Most High, come out and come here." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerged from the flames. The viceroys, prefects, governors, and royal advisors who were there saw that the fire had had no power on the bodies of these men. Not even their hair was singed. Their clothing looked the same, and they didn't smell of the fire. Set the scene. Nebuchadnezzar is positioned, obviously, at a safe distance where he can peer into this furnace through a side opening, no doubt. Nice guy that he was, he wanted to personally see the objects of his wrath roasted in the fire. But what's wrong with the picture? What he saw was unexpected. Not 3 bound men burning to a cinder, but 4 men walking around in the fire. And this astounded him, and he immediately consulted his counselors. As to the number of men cast in the fire, I can't believe my eyes. How many did we say were cast into the furnace? There were actually 5 things that startled the king. 1, there were 4 persons in the furnace, not 3. None of them in there were bound up. That all of these persons were walking around inside this hotter than ever, hotter than possibly could be made inferno. All 4 were obviously unharmed. And the 4th person looked like, and a better translation might be, a son of the gods. This comes from the Babylonian belief that their gods had sons. Polytheistic Nebuchadnezzar could believe in the fact that a lesser divinity could be sent by an all-powerful God. It was a pagan king's way of saying that the 4th person looked divine to him. And we know that he was. Looked like a supernatural being. Realizing that some kind of divine intervention had occurred, Nebuchadnezzar summons the 3 men out of the furnace by name. Also, when Nebuchadnezzar referred to El Elyon, the Most High God, he was not disavowing his own deities, but he was merely recognizing, because of what he had witnessed, that the God of Israel was higher than any other God. And remember, this is the second time that he's done this. He did this in chapter 2, after Daniel told him the dream and gave him the interpretation. He came to the same conclusion in chapter 2 as he did here, but yet he still rebelled. The God of Israel is greater than all my gods, yet I will rebel against the God of Israel. Still he had put his faith and trust in the false gods of Babylon. The 3 men obeyed the king's command, and they came out, and the king and all of his officials personally recognized, personally witnessed God's delivering power. These 3 men had not felt the burning, searing pain that had been planned for them. They examined the men and observed 4 facts that really evidence God's power. 1, no evidence of burning on their bodies, no blisters, no burn marks, nada. No singed hair. You can just imagine that. Been in that environment, not have any hair singed. No scorched or burned clothing, and no smell of smoke on them. It's like they had never been there. Nothing had drugged them into that condition. It's interesting to note that the constraints of the pagans on these men were burned away. They'd been bound, right? Yet as they're walking around in there, they're walking around with no binding upon them. Other than that, though, they hadn't been touched. They had not been touched. What we might consider here is that this deliverance of these 3 faithful Jews really foreshadows the deliverance of Israel at the end of the Gentile domination. When we get down past that statue that was in chapter 2 and the toes and feet of iron and clay. When the fire of whatever is being brought against Israel gets too hot for survival, Messiah Yeshua comes and walks with Israel while those that are bringing the heat get burned up. I thought about this and added it at a moment. We don't have an overhead for it, but this is what's spoken of in Zechariah chapter 13. Zechariah 13 says, "In time throughout that land, says Adonai, 2/3 of those in it will be destroyed. They will die. 1/3 will remain. That 1/3 I will bring through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined. I will test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them, and I will say, this is my people. And they will say, Adonai is my God." Go to Isaiah 43:1. Now this is what Adonai says, He who created you, Jacob, He who formed you, Israel. Don't be afraid, for I have redeemed you. I am calling you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through water, I will be with you. When you pass through rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you will not be scorched. The flame will not burn you, for I am Adonai, your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Pay attention. That word translated Savior here is Mashiach, Messiah. It is Messiah that walks through the fire with the faithful. This was written by Isaiah about 120 years prior to the fiery furnace. Very interestingly, though, by that time, Israel had walked through the waters, the Red Sea, and he was with them. Israel had passed through the river, the Jordan, and he was with them. And the fire is coming, and God promises to walk through that with the faithful of Israel as well. And these three boys are demonstrating for us the faithful of Israel. Revelation 13 speaks of a time when Israel will be delivered. This is foreshadowed for us in Daniel 3 and prophesied for us as well in Isaiah 43 as well as Zechariah chapter 13. Both of them speaking of being brought through the fire, refined as gold is refined. But God will deliver Israel at that time. It is Esau that will be consumed like stubble. Read Obadiah, verse 18 tells you that it is not Israel that is the stubble that is burned up. It is Esau, who represent today the Arabs. Wow. Well, let's see what Nebuchadnezzar does now. Daniel chapter 3, verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he has sent his angel to deliver his servants who trusted him. They defied the royal order to the point of being willing to give up their bodies in order not to serve or worship any god but their own God. Next. Therefore I herewith decree that anyone, no matter from which people, nation, or language, who says anything to insult the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is to be torn limb from limb, and his house is to be reduced to rubble, because there is no other God who can save like this. Then the king gave Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego higher rank in the province of Babylon. But the last thing that we need to take away from this, because there is no God, no other God, who can save like this. If while we kept going through this, if while we went through this, we kept that sidebar going, where we substituted the beast for Nebuchadnezzar, Hasatan for the gods of Babylon, we got a pretty good preview of what was going to happen or what is going to happen when Revelation chapter 13 comes into play. Think about the fact that this was written almost 2,600 years ago, put in Aramaic so that it could be read not only by the Jews but by the Gentiles. God wanted everybody to know and to understand this. That's why this last part was really put up there, because there is no other God who can save like this. No other God who can save like this. That would be so the Gentiles would know that there is a Most High God. And that Most High God is the God of Israel. Now, the first thing Nebuchadnezzar recognizes is the delivering power of God. And he commends these men for putting their trust in their God. He also recognizes their obligation to serve their God as a superior duty above everything else that they have to do in this world. And that should be something that stands out in the front of our minds. That Our obligation is to serve our God far more than any other obligation that we have as we walk this face of the earth. Nebuchadnezzar admits that this God of Israel is more powerful than all others, but he stops short. He stops short of declaring Israel's God as his own God. Now, what can we learn from this as we face these days? One, that human government is ordained by God. That's sometimes hard to realize, but it's true. Romans 13, verses 1 through 7 tells us this. Romans 13, 1 through 7. Number 2, governmental authority can abuse this God-given power by commanding things contrary to God's precepts. Oh, yeah. This goes on all the time. 3, when this occurs, a child of God must obey God rather than man. So important. When this occurs, a child of God must obey God rather than man. And when a child of God disobeys human government in order to obey God, he must take the consequences of the act, no matter what. Finally, it is in these times, I say right now, that we must recognize we exist for God's benefit, not our own benefit. We exist for God's benefit. Did we see how this really is much more than just a child story? If we'll let ourselves get past that this is just a child story, that this is really foreshadowing things that are coming in our future, and let the Holy Spirit lead us to everything that He has for us as laid out in this portion, we're going to win. We're going to win. Please, don't just set on this teaching that we're getting here. We need to continuously review what we're studying, assimilate it, make it our own. That's the most important thing that we can do. Chag Sameach, everybody.